In just 8 seconds, the entire chamber went silent, and then exploded. The words had barely left Barron's lips before the weight of them slammed into the air like a brick dropped in a cathedral. His voice, dripping with smug certainty, carried an insult so sharp it seemed designed to cut not just through Jasmine Crockett, but through everything she represented. The crowd, staffers, reporters, even jaded politicians who had heard it all, froze in collective disbelief. For one heartbeat, it was as if time itself refused to move forward. Eyes darted across the room. Some widened in shock, others narrowed in anticipation of the fallout. A cough died in someone's throat. The faint shuffle of papers ceased. Barron leaned back with the smirk of a man who thought he had just landed the final blow, the kind of smile that grows only in the absence of humility. He didn't know what was about to happen. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't scramble, didn't fumble. Her eyes locked onto his, calm but piercing, like a storm forming just beyond the horizon. It wasn't anger that filled the chamber, it was expectation. Everyone knew she had seconds to respond, and everyone knew this was the kind of moment that could define a career. And then, with a poise honed not by privilege but by perseverance, she delivered her answer. 8 seconds. That was all it took. 8 seconds to flip Barron's insult into something so devastating that the gasp of the crowd erupted like a sudden thunderclap. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reclamation, a reminder that dignity cannot be stolen by cheap words, and that arrogance is always one sentence away from collapse. Barron's smirk cracked as the ripple of Crockett's words spread across the chamber. First came silence, then came the unmistakable sound of stifled laughter, gasps turning into murmurs, murmurs swelling into a tide of astonishment. It was as if the entire room suddenly realized they had witnessed history fold itself into 8 unforgettable seconds. But this moment wasn't born in isolation. It didn't come out of thin air. To understand why the crowd gasped, why Barron's insult backfired so spectacularly, and why Crockett's 8-second counter lives on in the national memory, we have to rewind. Because before the thunderclap, there was a storm gathering. And that storm had been building for a long, long time. The clash didn't come out of nowhere. It was the product of weeks, months, of rising tension that had transformed the chamber into something less like a forum of democracy and more like a pressure cooker waiting for its lid to blow. Every hearing, every speech, every grandstanding gesture seemed to add another degree to the heat. And on this particular day, all eyes had shifted toward Jasmine Crockett, a freshman voice who had quickly become impossible to ignore. The country was already split down the middle, the partisan divide running jagged like a fault line through every headline and every dinner table argument. The debates weren't just about policy anymore, they had become battles over respect, recognition, and the very right to exist with dignity in a nation that prided itself on freedom yet struggled daily to embody it. In that room, the stakes were never just about bills or budgets. They were about identity. About pride. About who gets to speak with authority, and who is expected to stay silent. Crockett walked into the chamber knowing the spotlight was on her. She didn't wear the armor of privilege, she carried the scars of experience. For supporters watching, she wasn't merely another politician, she was a vessel of something larger. She was the daughter, the neighbor, the community fighter who dared to stand up in a place built to exclude voices like hers for generations. That weight pressed down on her shoulders, but it was also her fuel. Across the aisle, figures like Barron treated that weight like a weakness. They saw her composure as fragile, her determination as naive. To them, she was an easy target, young, outspoken, unwilling to shrink. In their minds, knocking her down would prove a point about order, about tradition, about who really held power in the chamber. They didn't realize that by aiming their fire at her, they were aiming at something much bigger, the hopes of millions who saw themselves in her struggle. Every exchange leading up to that fateful moment carried undertones of disdain and dismissal. Each time Crockett rose to speak, murmurs rippled across the benches like whispers of disapproval. And yet, each time she stood her ground, the murmurs grew sharper, more desperate, as though her very presence was an affront. The chamber wasn't just hosting a debate, it was hosting a collision between two visions of America, one rooted in exclusion, the other in belonging. For the immigrant families who had sacrificed everything to claim a future, for communities of color who had spent generations being told to wait their turn, for women who had fought to be heard in rooms designed to drown them out, this wasn't just theater. This was validation. When Barron insulted her, he wasn't just insulting Jasmine Crockett. He was insulting every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or underestimated. And that is why the gasp that followed her response carried so much force. It wasn't simply shock at a clever retort. It was recognition. It was vindication. Because the soul of America wasn't on the sidelines of this debate. It was right there in the chamber, watching. And as the insult fell, as Crockett prepared to respond, the country braced itself for the verdict of history. And the man behind the insult? His story reveals why this clash was inevitable. Long before the insult that brought the chamber to a standstill, Barron had been perfecting the art of arrogance. To his allies, he carried himself with the entitled swagger of someone convinced he could never be touched. To his critics, he was a walking symbol of everything broken in American politics: entitlement without accountability, bluster without substance, power without humility. His career was stitched together not by moments of service, but by a pattern of controversy. Time after time, Barron seemed to find himself in the headlines, not for legislation that changed lives, but for the sharp edge of his tongue and the bruises he left behind in the process. He had mocked colleagues, dismissed journalists, and belittled constituents who dared question him. Where others sought the mantle of leadership, Barron relished the thrill of domination. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to humiliate. There was no shortage of hypocrisy in his record. He campaigned on family values, while whispers of scandals trailed behind him like shadows he could never quite escape. He preached fiscal responsibility but had a knack for funneling taxpayer dollars into pet projects that curiously aligned with his donors' interests. He branded himself a man of the people, yet rarely seemed to be among them, preferring the company of lobbyists and exclusive gatherings where ordinary voices were muted. And then there was the condescension. The smirk that never left his face, the way he leaned back in his chair as if every question beneath him, every challenge a nuisance. To him, women in politics were interruptions, not equals. Immigrants were statistics, not neighbors. Communities of color were talking points, not living realities. It wasn't just his words that dripped with dismissal, it was the way he carried himself, the quiet signals of disdain that turned every interaction into a performance of superiority. For years, Barron thrived in this role. The cameras seemed to reward his cruelty, the headlines amplified his antics, and the system never held him to account. He began to believe he was untouchable. Each insult, each smirk, each grandiose speech delivered with mock sincerity added another brick to the fortress of ego he built around himself. But arrogance always has a blind spot. Barron mistook silence for submission. He confused composure with weakness. He believed that the same smirk that had carried him through scandals and setbacks would carry him through this confrontation too. What he didn't see, what he could never see, was that his behavior wasn't just an annoyance. It was a provocation. It was a call to battle. When he unleashed his insult on Crockett, he believed he was stepping into a familiar role, the dominant voice silencing the newcomer. What he failed to realize was that Crockett was no ordinary adversary. She wasn't rattled by the weight of his title, nor cowed by the history of his arrogance. She had faced storms before, storms far greater than a man with a smirk and a microphone. Barron's downfall was seeded long before that day. Every contradiction, every hypocrisy, every sneer prepared the ground for the moment when his arrogance would finally meet its match. He had written the script of his own undoing, line by line, without even realizing it. And when the curtain rose, when the chamber held its breath after his words landed, Barron thought he was about to enjoy another easy victory. Instead, he was seconds away from watching the fortress he had built collapse in front of an audience larger than he could imagine. But facing him was someone with a story of grit and survival that would change everything. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marbled halls of Congress. It began in the kind of neighborhoods where resilience is not a choice, but a requirement. Born into a working-class family, Crockett learned early that dignity is not handed down by privilege, it is earned, preserved, and defended against those eager to strip it away. Her childhood was colored by the quiet sacrifices of parents who stretched every dollar, who juggled multiple jobs, who taught their daughter that perseverance was the only inheritance they could guarantee. While others coasted on family names and inherited networks, Crockett carved her path with grit. She wasn't born into power, she wrestled her way into it, one hard-fought opportunity at a time. College was not a finishing school for a preordained future, but a battleground where she learned how stacked the odds could be against anyone who dared to come from the margins. She worked jobs between classes, she faced down doubters who questioned whether she belonged, and she discovered in herself a voice that could not be silenced. That voice led her to law. Not the corporate kind that fattens wallets, but the raw, unglamorous work of defending the underserved, clients who could not pay for prestige but who deserved justice all the same. Crockett found herself in cramped offices, late nights poring over files, standing up for those who had no one else to stand with them. She saw how systems bent easily toward those with privilege and power, and how easily those without it were crushed. Each case etched something deeper into her, an unshakable commitment to dignity. Service became her language, even when it came at personal cost. She endured the financial sacrifices of working for those who could not pay, the exhaustion of carrying other people's battles, the constant skepticism from a society that too often underestimated her because of her race, her gender, her youth. Every moment demanded composure under pressure, and Crockett delivered. When she decided to step into politics, it wasn't because she hungered for status. It was because she recognized that the fights she waged in court were symptoms of something larger, something systemic. To fix the problems, she needed to step inside the very halls where they were created. For many, the leap from community defender to Congress would be unthinkable. For Crockett, it was inevitable. She did not walk into Congress as an outsider begging for acceptance. She walked in as the embodiment of the voices too often ignored, carrying their stories on her shoulders. Every speech she delivered, every stance she took, came from that history. Her voice shook with the resonance of lived struggle, not rehearsed sound bites. Her eyes carried the weight of every neighbor she had defended, every client who had been silenced, every parent who had worked themselves raw so that she might have a chance. She was not playing politics, she was embodying survival. And survival, when sharpened by purpose, becomes a force no insult can diminish. What her critics mistook for inexperience was, in truth, her greatest strength. She knew chaos. She knew dismissal. She knew what it meant to walk into rooms where no one wanted her there and still claim her space. While Barron leaned on his smirk and arrogance, Crockett leaned on scars and sacrifices that had prepared her for the fire. That is why she didn't crumble when the spotlight turned her way. She didn't shake under the weight of judgment. She steadied herself with the knowledge that every step of her journey, from the hard-edged childhood lessons, to the courtroom battles, to the uphill fight into Congress, had prepared her for these moments. Moments where dignity was on trial. Moments where arrogance demanded a reckoning. To her supporters, Crockett's presence in the chamber was not just symbolic, it was deeply personal. She was proof that sacrifice mattered, that struggle could give rise to strength, that voices long silenced could thunder through marble halls. Her calm demeanor wasn't passivity, it was the composure of someone who had faced storms larger than insults and survived. So when Barron looked at her with that smirk, when he thought his words would cut her down, what he didn't see was the years of resilience standing behind her. He didn't see the child who grew up watching her parents defy exhaustion. He didn't see the lawyer who fought for the voiceless. He didn't see the woman who had faced every attempt to erase her dignity and refused to yield. And when Barron hurled his insult, everything she had lived through crystallized in just 8 seconds. The chamber was already restless when the exchange began. You could feel it in the way chairs creaked as lawmakers leaned forward, in the subtle rustle of papers that weren't really being read, in the low hum of whispers waiting to erupt. This wasn't routine business anymore, it was a confrontation everyone sensed was about to ignite. And at the center of it stood Barron, wearing his arrogance like a tailored suit. He started with the same swagger that had carried him through a dozen hearings. His voice, booming yet careless, dripped with condescension as he lectured Crockett about knowing her place. Each phrase was less about argument and more about performance, a chance to flaunt his authority before the cameras. He leaned back, folded his arms, and grinned as though he were already victorious. Crockett didn't bite. She let him talk. Her posture remained steady, her face composed, her eyes fixed on him with quiet intensity. She wasn't retreating, but she wasn't rushing to interrupt either. And that composure only seemed to infuriate Barron more. The louder he became, the calmer she appeared. Murmurs began to ripple across the chamber. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others scribbled furiously in notebooks, already sensing a headline taking shape. The atmosphere thickened with anticipation, like air before a storm. Barron mistook it for approval. He mistook silence for deference. He raised his voice higher, punctuating his insults with exaggerated hand gestures, turning his mockery into a spectacle. This chamber, he sneered, is no place for grandstanding or theatrics. The irony was almost too heavy to bear, the man delivering theatrics accusing someone else of it. A few chuckles broke from the press bench, quickly stifled, but the ripple was enough to sharpen the tension further. Still, Crockett held steady. She leaned forward slightly, not to match his volume, but to signal readiness. Every second she waited, every moment she chose silence over interruption, built suspense in the room. It was as if she was tightening a bowstring, holding it taut, waiting for the exact second to release. The crowd could feel it. They weren't just watching a debate, they were watching a collision. Every insult Barron piled on felt like one brick too many stacked on an already teetering tower. Every second Crockett remained calm made that tower wobble closer to collapse. The tension was unbearable, the silence between his barbs louder than his shouts. And then Barron overstepped. He delivered the insult, sharp, smug, and intended to slice through Crockett's dignity in front of the entire chamber. His words rang out with the force of arrogance unrestrained, and for a heartbeat, the chamber froze. The insult hung in the air, daring a response, demanding a reaction. All eyes turned to Crockett. She inhaled once, slow and deliberate. The calm on her face didn't break. It transformed. You could see the shift, the moment the patience of a lifetime condensed into a single choice. The crowd leaned in, holding their breath, sensing history balancing on the edge of her tongue. And then, in just 8 seconds, Crockett delivered the line that no one will ever forget. The insult had barely settled into the air when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the desk before her. For a fraction of a second, the chamber went still. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle, the kind of silence that only comes when everyone knows something seismic is about to happen. Barron sat back smugly, folding his arms as though he had already won. His smirk lingered, eyes scanning the room like a conquering general surveying his battlefield. He thought he had silenced her. He thought his words would hang above her like a verdict carved in stone. But then Crockett spoke. Her voice didn't rise to meet his. It didn't need to. It was calm, measured, deliberate, a scalpel against his hammer. "You see, Congressman," she began, her tone soft enough to force the crowd to lean in, "when you try to diminish me with insults, all you do is remind this chamber who you really are." A ripple of movement crossed the benches. Heads turned sharply. Pens froze mid-scribble. The opening line wasn't loud, but it landed like a gavel. Barron's smirk faltered. Just slightly. Crockett paused, letting the weight of her words settle before she continued. "You thought your words would define me. But what they've done, in just 8 seconds, is define you." Gasps echoed from the press gallery. Someone muttered, "Oh my God," under their breath. The chamber was no longer a stage for Barron's arrogance, it was a courtroom, and Crockett had just flipped the roles. The accused was now the accuser. She leaned back, eyes steady on Barron, and delivered the line that detonated the room. The difference between us is simple. You inherited your arrogance. I earned my dignity. The words hit with the precision of a thunderbolt. Silence stretched, snapped, and then collapsed into a wave of reactions. The crowd gasped in unison, a sharp, collective intake of breath followed by scattered laughter, claps stifled into fists, and a low murmur of disbelief. Even in a chamber used to drama, this was different. This was history compressing itself into a single sentence. Barron's composure cracked wide open. The smirk drained from his face, replaced by something he couldn't hide fast enough: fear. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted nervously across the room as if searching for escape. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the one writing the narrative. Crockett, by contrast, was immovable. She sat there, serene, as though she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. No shouting, no finger-pointing, no theatrics, just the raw power of composure. She let the silence that followed become her ally, stretching it long enough for everyone in the chamber to replay her words in their minds, over and over, until they sank in deeper than any speech Barron had ever given. It was like watching a slow-motion replay in real time. You could see the exact second the crowd realized they had witnessed a shift, not just a clever retort, but a reversal of power. Barron had set the trap, certain it would snare her. Instead, he found himself caught, dangling, exposed. Commentators would later describe it as one of the most devastating rebuttals ever delivered in the chamber. Memes would slice it into GIFs, hashtags would distill it into slogans, and pundits would argue over its long-term impact. But in that exact moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the electricity coursing through the room, the raw shock that such an insult had been so cleanly, so perfectly flipped back onto the man who launched it. Crockett hadn't just defended herself, she had turned his weapon into her shield. She had taken Barron's arrogance and shown it for what it truly was, weakness masquerading as strength. The chamber knew it. Barron knew it. And judging by the look on his face, he could feel his carefully constructed image beginning to unravel thread by thread. The silence returned again, heavier this time, punctuated by whispers that refused to die down. Crockett allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile, not of triumph, but of resolution. It wasn't about winning a point. It was about standing her ground, showing that dignity can't be bought, mocked, or erased. Barron shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers drumming the desk as though searching for something to anchor himself. But the more he moved, the more it was clear, he had lost. The chamber wasn't looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. And though it took just 8 seconds, it felt eternal. Eternal in the sense that long after the session adjourned, long after the lights dimmed and the headlines rolled out, those words would echo in the national memory. For the people who had been told they didn't belong, for the families who had endured insult after insult in silence, for the women who had been dismissed and demeaned by men in power, Crockett's words were more than a rebuttal. They were vindication. The crowd gasped not because they hadn't heard sharp words before, but because they had just seen something rare, dignity triumphing over arrogance in real time. It wasn't a sound bite, it was a reckoning. And as Barron sat stunned, Crockett's calm composure stood taller than any title he carried. But the real explosion came not inside the chamber, but outside it, across the entire nation. The moment Crockett's words hit the airwaves, they took on a life of their own. By the time the chamber adjourned, the clip had already begun its digital sprint across the country. Within minutes, it was clipped, captioned, and shared on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. 8 seconds of dignity flipped against arrogance became the heartbeat of 1,000 feeds. Hashtags erupted almost instantly. Hashtag 8 seconds trended alongside hashtag Crockett clapback. Users flooded timelines with reactions, fire emojis, stunned GIFs, slow clap memes. One viral tweet read, "Barron just got cooked in 8 seconds flat," racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. Another wrote, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond, she rewrote the rules." The internet, hungry for moments of truth in an era of cynicism, had found its new rallying cry. Late-night hosts seized the moment. Within hours, monologues opened with replayed clips of Barron's smirk collapsing in real time. One host joked, "Barron came with insults, but Crockett came with the receipt, and boy, did she cash it in." The audience roared. The chamber's tension had spilled out into comedy stages, newsrooms, and dinner tables across America. But it wasn't just jokes. News anchors leaned in with solemn commentary, calling it a watershed moment in modern congressional history. Analysts debated what it meant for power dynamics in Washington, but across the board, one truth was undeniable: Barron had lost control of the narrative. For once, his insult didn't define the headline. Crockett's dignity did. The ripple effect was felt beyond politics. Activists embraced the moment as symbolic of a larger cultural reckoning. Community leaders shared the clip at rallies, teachers replayed it in classrooms as an example of poise under pressure, and young people used it as a TikTok sound, lip-syncing Crockett's words with pride. Her response transcended the chamber. It became a cultural artifact, a moment of validation for every person who had ever been dismissed, demeaned, or underestimated. Meanwhile, Barron found himself in the eye of a storm he couldn't spin. Late-night laughter turned into morning talk show analysis, which turned into satirical TikToks reenacting his expression as the smirk slid from his face. Memes flooded the internet. One showed a collapsing sandcastle with the caption, "Barron's career after 8 seconds." Another looped his stunned reaction in slow motion, overlaid with dramatic movie music. For every meme mocking Barron, there were 10 celebrating Crockett. Comment threads filled with admiration. "This is why representation matters. She spoke for all of us." Dignity, arrogance, every single time. Social validation poured in not just from supporters, but from casual observers who rarely waded into politics yet recognized authenticity when they saw it. The clip wasn't just consumed, it was shared, dissected, replayed. Every angle of the camera, every pause in her delivery was analyzed like film students studying a masterpiece. Even political opponents grudgingly admitted she had handled herself with composure. But for those who saw themselves reflected in her strength, it was more than composure, it was triumph. Crockett became a trending name overnight, her follower count soaring, her inbox flooded with messages of gratitude and solidarity. The moment had given people more than entertainment, it had given them pride. It reminded viewers that arrogance could be challenged, that smirks could be shattered, that dignity could still win, even if only in 8 seconds. And yet, amid the roar of applause and validation, Crockett herself did something unexpected. She didn't bask in the glow of virality. She didn't turn the moment into a self-congratulatory tour. Instead, she spoke with humility, framing the clash not as her personal victory but as a symbol of something bigger. For her, it wasn't about one insult or one rebuttal. It was about the universal fight for respect, for equality, for recognition that every voice deserves dignity. The nation was watching, applauding, laughing, reposting. But Crockett refused to let the story stop there. Yet Crockett refused to let this moment be just about her, she turned it into something bigger. When the cameras circled back to her in the days that followed, Crockett refused to let the viral moment be remembered as just a clapback. She spoke with the same calm resolve that carried her through the chamber, but now she widened the frame. This, she explained, was never just about her. It was about what happens when arrogance is left unchallenged, when power is wielded to humiliate instead of serve, when dignity is mocked as weakness. She told audiences that she hadn't simply answered Barron, she had answered every person who had ever been diminished because of their name, their skin, their accent, or their background. What looked like a personal duel was, in truth, a test of whether respect still mattered in public life. And her 8-second reply, she insisted, was not born in the moment but forged through years of struggle, survival, and service. The message was unmistakable: dignity is greater than arrogance. Service outweighs privilege. True leadership isn't measured by volume or swagger but by the ability to hold your ground without sacrificing your humanity. Crowds listening to her words found themselves nodding, sometimes tearing up, sometimes cheering. Students posted videos of themselves repeating her lines with pride. Parents told their children, "This is what strength looks like." Commentators who had been jaded by years of political theater admitted that something about this felt different, less like spectacle, more like a reminder of the values America still claims to uphold. And Crockett made sure those values weren't abstract. She connected her experience to the broader story of America itself, a nation where immigrants, outsiders, and underdogs have always had to fight for their seat at the table. She spoke of her own journey as proof that standing tall in the face of mockery is not just possible, but necessary. Her composure was not weakness, it was discipline. Her restraint was not silence, it was strength in reserve. She invited her listeners to see themselves in her moment. Not everyone would face an insult on the congressional floor, but everyone, at some point, would face a test of respect. In classrooms, in workplaces, in families, in the small battles of everyday life, the same question lingers: will you let arrogance define you, or will you stand in dignity and flip it on its head? It was here that her message crescendoed. Crockett wasn't celebrating a personal victory, she was offering a blueprint. To every young woman of color doubting her voice, to every immigrant child told they didn't belong, to every ordinary person belittled by someone with more power, she offered a reminder that worth is not bestowed from above. It is carried within. And when arrogance strikes, dignity answers louder than any insult ever could. The crowd reactions to her speeches reflected the catharsis people had felt watching that chamber. They weren't just celebrating her, they were celebrating themselves, their resilience, their own unbroken spirit. Her moment had become theirs. And that's why this wasn't just an exchange, it was a movement. Crowd gasps as Jasmine Crockett flips Barron's insult in 8 seconds. That headline wasn't just clickbait. It captured a moment that showed how quickly arrogance can collapse when met with calm, unshakable truth. In those few seconds, Crockett proved that dignity can be louder than mockery, and service can outweigh privilege. But the real story isn't just about her. It's about us, all of us who have ever been dismissed, underestimated, or told we don't belong. Crockett's stand reminds us that we don't have to meet arrogance on its terms. We can hold our ground, speak with conviction, and flip insults into moments of power. That's why this video isn't just something to watch, it's something to carry forward. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that composure isn't weakness, it's strength. Subscribe so you don't miss the next moment where dignity stands tall against arrogance. And keep watching, because this isn't just political theater, it's the story of who we are and who we're becoming. You are part of this movement. Every view, every share, every conversation is proof that respect still matters, that truth can still pierce through noise, and that dignity will always rise above insult. So if Barron's smirk collapsing in real time made you feel something, let it fuel you. If Crockett's words lifted you, let them guide you. And if those 8 seconds gave you hope, don't keep it to yourself, pass it on. Because movements don't start in chambers. They start here, with us, choosing dignity over arrogance, every single time.